Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the podcast that is a legitimate lifestyle choice. I'm Dorian Linsky. On today's show, what was in and what was left out of the King's speech? What will Sunak's legislative swan song be like? Plus, Keir Starmer is expected to be a statesman on Gaza despite not being Prime Minister yet. What are the challenges for an opposition leader on the cusp of power? And in the extra bit for supporters, a tense moment for Suella Braverman on the issue of rough sleeping. Is the real crime the government's homeless strategy? There was a very, very, very faint laugh about the tense pun there.
Wince. I'm going to go with wince.
Jealousy, professional jealousy, I get it. Let's meet the panel. Matt Green is a jealous comedian and Twitter sensation. Hello, Matt.
Hello.
Donald Trump was in court earlier this week in his New York fraud trial, one of many trials. How did the defendant fare?
You'll be surprised to know poorly. He didn't do great. His main defence seems to be relying on the idea that his financial declarations had so-called worthless disclaimers in them, which meant that basically said a big not at the end of every disclaimer, or maybe. And that's an argument the judge has already declared worthless. The judge has said several times, please stop talking. He said this is a courtroom, not a political rally. But I think the problem is everything is a political rally for Trump these days. He knows that he can get politics out of anything. He can get political advantage out of looking like he's a victim. He always portrays himself as a victim. I imagine even when he's ordering food, he's like, I love a Big Mac. Do you know when I was president, the Macs were the biggest Macs in the world? Everyone said how big the Macs were. They were so big, and now the Macs are so bad. It's so sad. And I'll never be doing that accent again, don't worry. But my favourite thing was that I did read a report on what he said at the trial, and there were a couple of lovely quotes from him, which I think makes sense if you think of him as a 5-year-old, essentially, because there was one moment where he talked about Mar-a-Lago, and he said, if I want to build something, I built a very big ballroom that was built by me. It was very large, very beautiful. Lovely. And talking about a golf club, he said, at some point, at a very old age, I'll do the most beautiful thing you'll ever see. Which suggests that there might be a moment at the end of Trump's life where he does something incredible, and we're just waiting for that moment.
I think that's just sinister, to be honest.
No, what is the most? No, the worry. The worry is that the most beautiful thing you ever see is him pressing the nuclear button.
I did like the bit where he was asked why he hadn't submitted, I think, a return for 2021. He said he was busy running the country, and it had to be pointed out to him that he was no longer president.
Well, not according to him.
At that point, well. It's funny though. I mean, it's not funny. It's awful.
I think that whole sentence sums up the politics at the moment. It's funny. No, it's not. It's awful.
But any time Biden misspeaks, that's like, oh, he's sort of old and doddery, and then Trump literally just thinks he was president when he wasn't. And people are just like, what are you going to do?
Yeah. And
that's Donald.
And he said to the judge, I can tell the value of a building just by looking at it. That was one of his defences.
That would be a good TV show where he just walks around and you just point at buildings and he just tells you how much they're worth.
Yeah. And if it's got the word Trump on it, it's worth 1 billion times more.
It's the worst superhero power.
True.
Hannah Fearn is a columnist and reporter. Hi, Hannah.
Hello.
The COVID inquiry continues with confirmation this week that Boris Johnson did indeed say, let the bodies pile high, even though he had said that he didn't. And Rishi Sunak didn't warn key civil servants about his eat out to help out wheeze. It's still early days.
More to come.
Yeah. I mean, how could this get any worse for the government's reputation?
I think it's worse for Sunak than it was, because up until now, the Boris stuff, I'm not entirely surprised to hear that he did use those form of words. It's uniquely him. It sounds like him.
COVID into himself on television.
All of this nonsense. And the thing about the hairdryer, you remember that? There's a revelation that he apparently asked scientists whether it was possible to get rid of COVID by blowing a hairdryer up your nose.
From someone who's never used a hairdryer as well. Or any sort of hairstyling product.
Maybe we can excuse him if he doesn't know what a hairdryer is.
He has no idea what they do. He just assumes they're like magic amulets.
But this is bad for Sunak because it really reveals his absolute ineptitude during the same period, which I think we hinted at before, but he has been trying to portray himself as the voice of reason post-Boris. That's his entire shtick as PM. So this demonstrates that he also was absolutely not led by the science during this period. He was driven only by the economics. He launched this Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which we now know directly led to the resurgence of the virus. And he did so without the support and guidance of the emergency committee that the government had established, which is really shocking. But I think it points to an important thing about him, which voters, I think, are now waking up to, which is that he treats the economy as if it's all numbers and not people, but people make the economy, and people have this, slightly problematic thing of being human, getting viruses themselves, becoming ill, having children.
Numbers don't get viruses. Numbers are good.
Exactly. I mean, he just behaves as if the money is all, but the people control the money, and it really shows, I think, his weaknesses as a prime minister, that he can't relate to people. So that, I think, will be a problem for him.
Well, I noticed some prominent journalists, like broadcast journalists, were going, this is worse than we imagined, and they got told off on Twitter because they were like, we knew, you should have known, and you're a lapdog, and why didn't you know? But I think I think they're zhuzhing it up. Like, you want to get people to listen to the news by going, you won't believe this. But also, I think it's possible to know that it was bad and still be surprised by, like, how bad. Still be surprised by certain details.
Look,
I think I had no faith in Boris Johnson, but the hairdryer thing, I was like, oh, that's worse.
Yes, exactly that. Also with Sunak, I genuinely, I was working as a senior journalist at the time. I was working as a section editor on a national newspaper. During the early months of the COVID crisis, I genuinely thought that Sunak was a sensible voice compared to some of the other lunatics in the asylum. I was wrong, it turns out. I think to assume that everybody is in on it who works in journalism is a kind of level of conspiracy theory that's just not true in this country. 90% of what you see to do with the media and politics is cock up, not conspiracy. That's my starting point for it, having been on the inside of journalism. It's always cock up, it's never conspiracy. And I think we were genuinely surprised.
Our returning guest this week is Robert Saunders, a reader in modern British history at Queen Mary University of London, author of Yes to Europe, the 1975 Referendum and 70s Britain, and still one of Twitter's sanest voices. Oh. Welcome back, Robert.
Thank you very much.
Just Stop Oil activists smashed the glass of the Rokeby Venus this week, a 1640s masterpiece which amateur art historian Esther McVeigh described as a painting of the suffragettes, rather than a painting the suffragettes are symbolically slashed several centuries later. Just Stop Oil said women didn't get the vote by voting, which is technically true for obvious reasons. Robert, you tweeted in response, we should worry a lot more about why so many today, especially the young, feel so little hope in electoral politics. Now, that's certainly the case with sort of non-violent direct action. Do you think that is a broader problem?
I do, and I think it really matters. I spend a lot of my time as a historian with cobwebs in my hair, thinking about people like the suffragettes or the Chartists or reformers, people who put their bodies on the line and their lives on the line in order to win the vote. And they did that because they believed in the power of the vote. They thought that they could use the vote to do all of the other things that they wanted to do, to change the world. And I think it really should worry us that so many deeply idealistic people today look at our electoral system and our party system and our parliamentary politics and see absolutely no hope of change in that form whatsoever. And I think that really should disturb us, because if people lose faith in constitutional methods for change, they will turn to unconstitutional methods. And you can pass all the sentencing laws and all the kind of crackdowns that you like, but it won't protect you from that.
Well, there's a version of this in the US where there's a concern that, youth turnout for Biden will be much lower in 2024 because of a general sort of lack of faith in anything changing, which would end up benefiting Donald Trump. So it's not just people, like you said, some people perhaps turning to more extreme methods, but it's a lot of people just thinking, well, what's the point? And if people on the left say, what's the point, then people on the right tend to win.
Yeah, it becomes self-reinforcing. I think a lot of people in Just Stop Oil say that an oil executive wants to influence politics outside the electoral process. They have so many ways in which they can do that. They can fund a think tank. They can pay for an all-party group. They can hire members of parliament as consultants. They can fund slightly dodgy reports. If they pay enough to a party, they can sit down for dinner and private meetings with the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. If you're a teenager who wants to stop the planet burning, you haven't really got that possibility. But you're stuck in a kind of loop where you look at electoral politics and think that's just not going to work for us. But if you step out of electoral politics, then those are the people who are going to prosper.
Before we start, a quick update about our live show at the Comedy Store. Tickets are selling fast and Patreon backers can get an exclusive member discount. I'll be joined by Roz, Alex and James O'Brien in London's West End on Wednesday, December the 13th. I love the phrase London's West End. It's the best of all the West Ends. Search Patreon Ogre What Now to find out how to sign up as a supporter. As well as the discount, you'll get this podcast early and ad-free, plus extra shows and merch. First this week, in the last King's Speech before an election, Rishi Sunak's parliamentary priorities were laid out, such as they are. It was the longest monarch speech since 2005 and possibly the thinnest. Sky's Tom Larkin pointed out they had the fewest bills since 2014. Many words, minimal action. Which sounds like a brilliant politics slogan for Sunak. Labour MP Chris Bryant quipped, "This isn't a legislative programme for a year. We could get all this done in a fortnight and then have a general election." Matt, can you imagine if you've been waiting years, nay decades, to become monarch, and this was the first speech that you were given?
I do feel slightly sorry for King Prince Charles because
Just to give him his full name.
His full given name. Because he has been waiting decades to be king, and his first Prime Minister was Liz Truss, and his first King's Speech is this sort of fag end of a speech where no one really... There's not much to say in it. And they say that the monarch is meant to deliver the speech quite flat without any emotion, particularly because they don't want to show any sense of, favouring one side or the other. And if that's the case, he really understood the assignment because I don't think I could have heard a person sound more bored if he tried. It was extraordinary. I mean, watching it, it was like he was trying to be the most boring he'd ever been in his life. I've never heard him have that little animation in his speech.
The problem is you're not given, unlike in show business, if you're given a thin script, there might be potential for improv.
Yeah.
And there's a strict, I believe, in the Constitution, no improv rule.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, there were
It'd be good if he could just throw in the occasional, just like, Charles policy.
Yeah, he didn't even do any kind of, or like... moments, which would have
like
been quite nice.
Bloody pen moment.
There was one moment where he turned a page, and I could definitely feel. I think it was around the oil and gas expansion, which I think we can all agree is probably not his favourite idea. He sort of turned a page, and I thought quite an angry way, sort of flipped the page and sort of was a bit. But I think that was the limit of how much he could express himself.
Well, King Prince Charles had to say, "My government's priority is to make the difficult but necessary long-term decisions to change this country for the better," a line which may have been written by Rishi Sunak. Sunak himself said, "This King's Speech delivers change in our economy, change in our society, change in our communities." Do either of those statements bear any relationship to the actual policies? There are 21, but it feels like fewer.
Yeah, I mean, I did feel watching it that this government setting out its long-term plans for the future is a bit like a mayfly telling you what it's up to next week. Like, it's pretty clear that that's not going to be the case, that they're going to get much of this done or even... basically, it felt like it was a mixture of small, short-term things that they might get done, which might help a few people, it might be fine, and then long-term things that absolutely will never get done by them anyway, and possibly they'll get taken up in some other form. I thought the leasehold stuff sounded kind of positive, but also didn't seem like it was going far enough. The football regulator, that's something the football fans have been calling for a long time, so that was kind of positive. There were lots of little things. You thought, that's not a bad idea.
Are you excited to be free from the scourge of pedicabs?
Well, quite.
Because you talk of nothing else.
I know. Well, I do work in Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus a lot doing comedy, and they are everywhere. I've never been on a pedicab because I've never liked extreme sports. But they are very annoying, pedicabs. They're very loud, and they go past playing incredibly loud music when you're trying to do a gig in a venue which has no good sound installation. That's happened a few times to me. But yeah, apparently though the reason for that is that it's like rogue pedicabs are an issue. There are like people who like getting charged like hundreds of pounds for travelling a short distance, and that is outrageous. No one should be charged a lot of money for a short journey unless you're
It does seem though like it's not a grand vision for the nation.
No. Oh, there's lovely detail.
Although it may feel differently if I'd been robbed for £100 for a pedicab ride.
There's a little detail about it I loved, which is apparently there's a law from 1869, which is why they couldn't ban them, because they are classed currently as stage carriages. What a lovely sort of historical... They're almost like the last remnants of a sort of dying breed, that these from stage carriages to pedicabs.
Hannah, pedicabs covered. Which policies do you think were conspicuous by their absence, whether ones you approve of or ones you do not?
Well, I agree that the leasehold thing only went so far. It didn't actually get rid of leasehold. It was the compromise that shut some campaigners up while also keeping people with large stakes in property happy. So for me, nowhere near enough. Conspicuous by their absence, low traffic neighbourhoods. I live in Streatham. If anybody has been following the London news lately, we've got a new low traffic neighbourhood and it has caused fury. So to not see that there when it's a live issue in London again right now, and clearly Sunak's been talking about it as if they're pegging their election hopes on this, and yet it's not there. Equally, the tents for people, banning tents for people who are street homeless, again, a massive talking point in the last 3 weeks. It's not there. I'm not surprised. That's obviously the right thing that it's not there. But again, all the chat has led to nothing. And perhaps the most surprising, Sunak stood up in his conference speech and promised a new future of education to age 18 post A-levels. We're going to have this new qualification. Everybody will study maths to 18. It'll be this dawn of a new era. It's not there. So if he's not going to deliver it, who will? Because this isn't a Labour commitment.
Maybe the jocks had a word with him and kicked this nerd policy out of the King's speech.
And the other thing that Sunak's been really keen on, in fact, to be fair to him, not just in the last couple of years, but for as long as we've seen him in government in any position, is AI regulation. And given that we had the big conference last week and his one-to-one with Elon Musk, which was bizarre, strange to see that doesn't feature at all. So where is the big kind of I am policies, that this is what I'm about? We're not seeing any of that now.
One missing bill was the promised ban on conversion therapy.
Yeah, also
so is that kind of, is he sort of scared of his sort of nuttier backbenchers there? Miriam Cates is going to kick off.
I don't know if
convert them.
Scared of them. He needs to have something left there to be part of his, culture wars strategy. If he pushes everything through that's against them, what has he got left? I don't know. It's interesting. Nothing in the culture wars seems to be there.
But it's sort of weird because there's useful stuff that he could have done, like mental health reform, which was promised, and things to do with public services, and I don't know, just useful things that might change people's lives. But then also, like you said, the LTNs, which would have been a great little cheeky bit of culture war action, also dropped. So it's not even like a fighty speech.
On public services, there was nothing on the 7 bins nonsense.
So now we're going to have 7 bins.
Who knows?
What about meat tax not mentioned?
But also equally, they've got the rail reform bill going through, but they haven't committed to getting it through this Parliament. So it's there to say, oh, here we are, we're going to do rail reform. But the creation of Great British Railways won't happen before Sunak's out. So will it happen under Starmer? It's not clear yet what their plan is. So all of this stuff on important public services, whether or not you're pro or anti-7 bins, or the bigger stuff around transport post-cancelling HS2, there's no clarity.
I kept thinking, I was reading these explainers, and I kept thinking I'd missed one. I was almost like lifting up policies to see if there was another policy underneath.
Smoking feels like that's the kind of the big one that he wants to really sort of put front and centre, but Labour seem to be quite pro that. So it's not a dividing line. It's just a health idea.
Smoking feels like the only one that you can attach to the person who was standing at delivering the conference speech that he delivered only a month ago.
He really hates the gaspers. That might be the only real legacy of this speech then, only because Labour likes it.
Yeah, possibly so.
Robert, as Prince Charles, the King was a vocal Green campaigner for a very long time. That was mainly what he's famous for, and also not liking buildings. He could do the show with Donald Trump, where Donald Trump says how much they're worth, and King Prince Charles just shakes his head and goes, "Ooh, don't like that one." So he can't be happy with the net zero backpedaling. Does this ritual, and of course it is a lot of, it is one of those things that must seem quite bizarre to people outside the country and many people inside the country. Does it seem especially archaic when we know full well that the monarch dislikes at least one of the policies that he's announcing?
As opposed to the frosting modernity of the rest of the spectacle.
But I mean, does it kind of, it's obviously like there's this pretense, it's suspension of disbelief, and you just go, well, I guess this is stuff the monarch is into. it's quite unusual because with the Queen, of course, she'd been Queen for so long, we didn't really know what she thought. Here, we know full well on the environment what he thinks.
Well, there were moments with the late Queen, weren't there, where we tried to read the runes. There was the time when she arrived dressed as the EU flag, which some people saw as a symbol. I think the prize probably goes to Queen Victoria in 1886, when it was fairly clear there was about to be a Liberal government that was going to try to legislate to restore the Parliament in Dublin, Home Rule for Ireland. And Victoria zoomed across to the House and made a speech in which she said that the Union with Ireland was a fundamental law and that she was resolutely opposed to its disturbance and expected them to support her. So I guess if the choice is between a monarch kind of grinding his molars and reading out what's in front of him and a monarch who's actively sabotaging the programme of the elected government, then I guess I'd probably go for the first of those. And, fundamentally, these are terrible policies if you believe in tackling climate change. But the king isn't going to save us from them. And there's a degree of displacement activity there. It's actually our job as the electorate and the demos, if we don't want this to happen, to stop it happening.
There was a little bit of a sense, there was a bit of kind of Romaniac fan fiction a few years ago that the Queen was just going to kind of like get up, just like tear the paper and just go, no. That somehow the monarch would sort of save us.
It would have been tempting, wouldn't it? I mean, all those decades of impeccable statecraft, just to say one's government is a disaster.
Just total mic drop it. Is the final King/Queen speech before an election always thin gruel? Or if you really want to, if they actually had any ideas in their tiny heads, could they have done more with this last, year maximum?
Well, I think a Queen's speech or a King's speech is always mostly theatre. I mean, I think very few of us would say, the 2013 Queen's speech was a banger. Or, most historians couldn't actually tell you what was in the King's speech.
Queen's speech is ranked.
In any given year.
That's a listicle we've not yet seen.
Like Taylor Swift songs, all of them.
I mean, I do think there are perhaps specific reasons why this one is so thin. And one of them is that this isn't actually a government that's wild about passing legislation through Parliament. It much prefers to govern through executive action. So what it really likes to do is to pass really quite wide-ranging measures that simply transfer powers to ministers, that ministers can then use to do what they want. So, perhaps bigger than most of what was in the King's speech was on Tuesday, the Transport Secretary announced that he would be imposing minimum service levels on transport unions, on ambulance workers and on border staff, which he can do under the powers of an earlier bill. I suspect after this weekend we might see further restrictions on protests. Suella Braverman's going to be able to do most of what she wants to do, using the powers that she already has to rewrite acts that have passed. So this isn't a government that really sees Parliament as where the action is, which is why, in the last session, I think Parliament went home early on more than half of all the sitting days, and it was an unusually low number of sitting days. So I think the action of the next year isn't really going to come from bills going through the House. It's going to come from executive action.
Well, you tweeted something which made me think that we often complain that commentators don't talk enough about policy and they go straight to sort of political strategy. And this is quite a common complaint about why a lot of people actually don't understand, the public don't understand enough about policies, because it's all about how's this going to play in the swing seats rather than what will this do to people's human lives? And you tweeted something like that. But I just wondered in this case, and I feel this about basically everything the government says, is it time well spent digging into policies which are not going to go through? There's so much that's just raised and you just it's just a vibe.
I think it is necessary to do because, firstly, although it's quite thin gruel, there are some lumps in there. There is some meatier legislation that we've touched on. I would quite like to know in more detail what this is going to mean for things like tech regulation or what it's going to mean for reforms to Leveson. But also, I think the question of how an issue will play might be different if there was some understanding among the public of what it actually did. So the question of how are these oil and gas licenses going to play might be different if there was more understanding of will it actually reduce prices? Will it actually make us more energy independent? Is it actually compatible with our climate goals? And if we take seriously the idea that democracy produces better government, then the question of how something plays and what it does shouldn't be quite as far apart as they seem to be today.
Well, the Tories stuck out a message where they were saying that we had British oil and Starmer was going to have Russian oil, as if, occluding the basic fact that British oil and gas does not just come into Britain and get sat on Britain. It goes out to the market and then we have to buy it back. It's much more complicated than just like what we find we keep. And that did seem to be, so I did wonder when I saw that, I was like, well, how many people who see this are going to know that this is complete nonsense?
Yeah, and I think it is really important that political journalists don't just see themselves as football commentators, that they also actually have an educative role as well, to tell the public what it is that those in power are doing.
Now let's have a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you too can submit a question for the panel. This is from Callum Ballard. What petty hobby horse legislation would the panel have snuck into the King's speech? If you need inspiration, I would have abolished clock changes.
Hear, hear. See, kids, yeah, awful.
So, yeah, I'm not a petty man, but some people in this room might be. Matt.
Hello. I've got a list. The two things that immediately sprung to mind just then were, number one, ban leaf blowers. I cannot stand leaf blowers. They're noisy. They're really bad for the environment, a lot of them, because a lot of them are petrol sort of powered, and they just belch out black smoke everywhere.
They can cure COVID, though.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. If you turn the other way around.
They're like really big hair dryers, so they're very powerful.
That's true, I hadn't really thought about that. And the other problem is that they don't seem to do anything most of the time. The number of times I saw someone the other day, just a guy, like gardener, just blowing leaves sort of onto a path, and then just leaving them. And then just think, well, yeah, that's not doing anything, is it? Slowly the leaves are just going to go back onto the grass. The other thing that I really genuinely think we should ban, and I think this should be banned from legislatively, is every company that you call on the phone should be banned from using the phrase, your call is important to us, or we are experiencing unusually high call volumes, unless they can prove with data that both of those statements are true.
That it is unusual, because you hear unusually high quite a lot, and it's like, is this just normal call volume?
These are normal call volumes.
And you don't have enough people.
It's not. It's just a tactic to make you put the phone down, because they always say, we're experiencing unusual call volumes. Maybe you'd like to contact us on our website.
Why not look at our website / go fuck yourself?
Yeah.
Absolutely that.
I'm not sure you
Goodbye.
can abolish leaf blowers, though, because I think under an 1869 statute, they're classed as brooms.
That's true.
Hannah.
Okay, so I've said this before for a different question, but I'm just going to hammer it home again. My piece of personal legislation would be this. Nobody should be allowed to become a landlord unless they have been a tenant for at least 1 year of their life. I just think that would just sort everything out in life.
I like it.
Excellent.
That'd be quite good. It's sort of a walk a mile in
I thought you
the
were
shoes vibe.
You could be more brutal, just that nobody's allowed to be a landlord, full stop. That's slightly
That
further.
would cause too many...
More sort of
Unfortunately,
Maoist approach.
exactly.
I'm far too dug into the housing sector to know that would just destroy everything. But I really think, walk a mile in those shoes. Know what it's like to have a landlord that doesn't answer the phone about a mould problem. Know what it's like to not be able to get your deposit back because someone's being vexatious before you get anywhere near making a profit off other people's housing.
I think you would need to add an extra little bit to that the landlord that you had can't have been a member of your family.
Correct,
As well, because I think there's a lot of that sort of, my mum was my landlord.
You have to have been a proper landlord with a contract with someone you don't know or an organisation you
Living
don't
with
know.
mould.
Yeah, living with some kind of disrepair problem.
Or just, failing that, you just have to go around to landlords' houses and sow mould. Robert?
Mine is much less high-minded. I would ban mobile phones that go zzz, zzz, zzz. I'm a reasonably placid person. I, plod around in my slippers and I'm nice to cats. But there's something about that sound that just makes me want to get the hammer out.
You don't like the vibrates. You want a more of a kind of ding 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 ding. You like a chime instead?
I think I quite like silence, really. But if I could start one piece at a time, I'll begin with a zzz noise.
Oh dear, mine's set to zzz.
Also, mine too.
I didn't have one until Robert mentioned think tanks. And it reminded me the other day that I was watching some think tank ghoul on Newsnight, and just thinking, why are there so many of these people? Like so many of the ills in our society and in politics, and I think this has been climate denial is the big case of this, but there are so many, are just these fuckers from just sort of the institution of, and there was names like the institution of neutral thinking, and then and they're always like they're sort of funded by very similar people. We'll all know about the Tufton Street network, and they continue to appear on the news as if they're just like some concerned citizens who have been thinking about stuff, and it's like it's the motorists, association.
Yeah. The normal guys club.
Yeah, they're not again. Well, they seem reasonable.
Yeah. Common sense brigade.
Yes, migration concern. I'm just concerned. Yeah. And I just think all those people should either not be on television, or if they are on television, should have to, one, be announced like what their political leanings are, like the fact that despite their name, they are not just like a bunch of concerned citizens, and two, have to have transparent funding.
This isn't my idea. I can't remember who suggested this, but someone suggested on Twitter that people like that should be like racing car drivers. They should have to have patches sewed into their clothes representing their sponsors.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you should just be able to see from, that's who they're sponsored by. It's Koch brothers. That's who they are.
But it seems like you're just allowed to be on sort of Question Time or whatever. And it's not somebody who is well known, even as in the sense that journalists are well known. It's just the latest person who works for like the IEA or whatever. And I'm like, on what basis?
Well, I can back that. Yeah.
The Victorians used to talk about a plutocracy working on a democracy. And I think that's a very good example of that. And it goes back to that point about the unequal power that people have in democratic politics.
I mean, I'd like to just sort of ban the whole concept of think tanks, but maybe that's for when my regime is more established.
That's year 2.
That's
your year 5, your 5-year plan.
Yeah. Now, Labour unrest over Keir Starmer's position on the war in Gaza rolls into yet another week, with frontbencher Imran Hussain resigning in order to be free to call for a ceasefire. Some people argue that Starmer's position is moot on a practical level because he has no power to influence the UK government, let alone the Israelis. Others respond that it's not just a question of principle, it's an indication of how he would act in number 10. We've talked in recent weeks about the specific issue of a ceasefire, but this raises the question of how much it is reasonable to expect from a Prime Minister in waiting. If Stanley Baldwin famously accused newspaper proprietors of seeking power without responsibility, does an opposition leader headed for victory have responsibility without power? Hannah, it sometimes feels like Starmer is under more scrutiny on this issue than the actual Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And obviously part of that reason is that Palestine is a major issue for the Labour Party. But is he also being assessed more and more as the next Prime Minister rather than just an opposition leader?
I think it's the combination of those together. So yes, it is about this leader in waiting type persona that he's now got to build. How will he act on the world stage? Is it? It's a shadow of what we want to see in the future. Plus, also, is he acting as a kind of an effective opposition now? Do we feel like he's becoming the sort of person who can challenge a general election? But it is also about the Labour Party and what it is, as you hinted at. Palestine's a massive issue. Obviously, the Corbyn shadow of anti-Semitism. It's all playing out now. And it's not just about his world stage figure. It's what sort of Prime Minister could he be? Has he moved sufficiently beyond that? And some see what they want in him now. Some see what they don't want. And there's no real way for him to get beyond that other than to just pick his channel and stick to it in a very sensible, calm way. And that's what he's done. And of course, there'll be a large faction of the Labour Party support that doesn't like the version of Starmer they're seeing now. But I think his comfort with that discomfort is actually stands him in good stead.
Matt, hopefully Netanyahu won't be in power for much longer. He's incredibly unpopular for having fucked up.
Although people have been saying that about Netanyahu for years. So.
I've personally been saying that. But yeah, I mean, things are looking quite bad for him. But PM Starmer, if that happens, will have to deal with one Israeli Prime Minister or another. So do you think that part of his calculation versus, for example, if this crisis had erupted 3 years ago, when Labour was basically considered like a decade from power. Do you think he's aware that whatever he says now might be quoted back to him by Israel like a year down the line? That it's a different consideration the closer you get.
Yes, I think probably that is part of it. I don't know how much influence the British Prime Minister even has on Israel these days, especially the current very right-wing Likud plus really right-wing other parties.
I think none.
Yeah, I mean, almost the opposite. I think almost it might be seen as almost a badge of honour to be resisting what Britain says. I suspect this whole thing is probably much more about trying to stay on side with the American position, to not be too far away from what Biden is suggesting. David Lammy's been quite strong in recent days. Written an article in The Observer over the weekend urging Israel to stop the violence in the West Bank, to prevent the siege conditions in Gaza, stressing the international law aspect, stressing that Israel has to be very careful about how it targets and things, and emphasising also that Labour would work for a two-state solution. So I think they do have quite a strong position on it, which a lot of people, certainly on the right of Israel, and there is a lot of people on the right of Israel in politics in Israel at the moment, they would hate that. So I think, in a sense, whatever Keir Starmer says, I don't think anyone in Israel in that part of the governing party will care.
Well, people who think that Starmer is showing sort of undiluted support for Israel should talk to some of the people who show undiluted support for Israel and find that they consider this disgracefully wishy-washy.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison that slightly struck me just then is that it's almost a bit like the BBC, that whenever anyone asks, I mean, this issue is a good example of it. Whenever people say anything about the BBC, it's always like they're incredibly pro-Israel, they're incredibly pro-Palestine, or they're pro-Hamas, or they're pro-Likud, or whatever. And it's always somewhere in the middle. And yes, on any given day, there'll be some reports and some people who go one way or the other. But in general, they're probably they're trying to find an incredibly difficult middle ground. Whether they're successful or not is, who knows? But I think that's probably where Starmer is a little bit at the moment as well.
Jeremy Corbyn's main obsession was foreign policy. I think he was far more interested in that than in domestic policy. So I think, love it or hate it, I suppose you could say that you knew what his foreign policy was, even though Labour's official foreign policy was somewhat diluted version. Do you understand what Labour's foreign policy philosophy is right now? Like, when you look at Starmer, when you look at Lammy, like, do you understand what is there a clear agenda, a clear sense of how they would act?
I don't know if I'd say it's a very clear sense or a clear agenda. I think David Lammy has made some pronouncements in the last year or so as Shadow Foreign Secretary. He's said that new ties with the EU would be Labour's top priority, and that's very positive. Obviously, that's before the Israel-Palestine situation sort of blew up again. He's also been talking a lot about climate justice, about linking up with other people across the world on that, global anti-corruption. And generally, I think, if you could sum up in a sentence, it's trying to rejoin the global community a bit, try to make the UK feel less like a pariah as it has in the last few years, and not a country that's sort of smashing up agreements and going off on its own and just trying to sort of going screw you to its neighbours and friends, trying to be a little bit like, I guess, Biden did after Trump. And he said something literally like, we're rejoining the world's stage or something. And I suspect that's what Labour were hoping to do. Now, I think obviously the Israel situation has made that much more fraught. I think obviously everyone would hope that none of this had happened, but I suspect Labour particularly thinking, we would have been able to have a much clearer, Europe is our focus, then global strategies on climate, and now obviously all eyes are on there, and that's very difficult for them.
Well, it's a no-win. Wherever you stand on that, politically it is a no-win.
Sure.
Robert, Corbynites see Corbyn's foreign policy positions as sort of the true heart of Labour. But have Labour governments always had a more pragmatic, or even sometimes like hawkish, foreign policy? Going back to, I suppose, Ernest Bevin being a key example.
Yes, there's always been a more kind of hard-nosed version of Labour foreign policy. Labour is integral to the creation of NATO. It's a Labour government that builds the nuclear bomb. You mentioned Ernest Bevin. There's a famous scene in the Labour Party conference in 1935 when Labour actually had a pacifist leader, George Lansbury, and he's taken down by Bevin, who accuses him of hawking his conscience around the conference and looking for someone to tell him what to do with it. But alongside that, Labour always tends to think quite moralistically about foreign policy. So there's a kind of small c tradition of foreign policy, which says it's about British interests, it's about statecraft, it's about realpolitik. Now, not all Conservatives think about foreign policy in that way. It's really hard for Labour to think about foreign policy in that way because its MPs and its activists in particular really want to see foreign policy as a kind of arena of great moral causes and a place, where you stand by the powerless. You're about to jump in.
Sorry. No.
So that's always been there, and I think it's, in many ways, that's a really admirable impulse. I would want governments to think about foreign policy in that way, but it does make it much more flammable. So it means that something like Vietnam is much harder for the Labour Party than it is for the Conservative Party. Iraq is much harder for Labour, and not just because it's in power. And an issue like this one, where the kind of moral lines are so entangled, could almost have been kind of grown in a laboratory, I think, to play to Labour's neuroses and difficulties around foreign affairs.
Was Wilson's refusal to join Lyndon Johnson's war in Vietnam, what guided that decision? Because that was often brought up when Blair seemed to be going along with Bush. Now, I see that as actually that was Blair's own moral crusade, which was misguided, but it was a lot more than just going, I'll do whatever America does. But to put that to one side, it was brought up, we didn't follow America into Vietnam. Was that a case of Wilson being extremely moral because he thought it was a bad war, or was it pragmatic?
Well, what's interesting there is that since the Iraq War, we say Wilson refused to join the Vietnam War, and that makes him in some ways popular on the left. At the time, the story is Wilson refuses to condemn the Vietnam War, which makes him rather a villain for the left. Wilson was in a really difficult situation at that point, because on the one hand, his party, his activists, much of his country was really strongly opposed to what was happening at Vietnam. But on the other hand, he's coming under colossal pressure from President Johnson to send, he says, even a troop of bagpipers, some kind of symbolic support. And this is a country on which Britain was very dependent economically and diplomatically. So Wilson walks a kind of tightrope in which he won't support the war, he won't send the bagpipers, but he also won't condemn it either. And that did him tremendous damage at the time. We've been thinking about the Beatles this week with their last single. John Lennon sends his MBE back to the palace in 1969 in protest at, as he puts it, Harold Wilson's support for the Vietnam War. So it's interesting how Iraq has changed the way that we remember what Wilson did on Vietnam.
We missed out on a very good Vietnam War movie about bagpipers.
There's still time.
Platoon. Come on.
Robert, what's the Labour Party's history with Israel and Zionism?
Well, it's interesting. The Labour Party's position on this has really moved. That Labour used to be much the more pro-Zionist of the two parties. In fact, if you go right back to the start of the 20th century, before the Balfour Declaration, Labour was calling for a Jewish homeland. And that's partly because, as a working class party, it was in much more living contact with working class Jews who had arrived in London from the pogroms in Russia and from persecution in other parts of Europe. So there was always that strand within the Labour Party which wanted to stand by Jews as a persecuted people and was sympathetic to Zionism for that reason. And that runs through Cable Street. It runs, of course, through the Holocaust. And then in the post-war period, there are lots of left-wing hopes vested in Israel. People like Tony Benn are enthusiastic about Israel, partly because of what they see as its economic model. John Landsman spends time on a kibbutz in the 1970s. I think Bevin again talks about how the Star of Bethlehem is the star of socialism. So there's this long tradition, and that tradition is still there.
Because the Labour left was actually more enthusiastic than the Labour right.
Yes, and that's still present in this argument that there's often a sense in Labour's kind of horrible internal debates about anti-Semitism that the Labour Friends of Israel is some kind of outpost of Mossad. It's not. There is a really deep emotional connection here in large parts of the party. But you also get alongside that from the 1970s a growing criticism of Israel, partly as its politics moves to the right. It's all Labour governments pretty much until the late 1970s, partly as Israel, the kind of balance of military power in the region shifts, partly as the dire situation of Palestinian refugees becomes more prominent in the West. So what you get are kind of two strains in the Labour Party then, which aren't just two separate camps, they're often in the same people. So this is a peculiarly neuralgic issue, I think, for the Labour Party.
Hannah, people like Owen Jones talk of complicity in war crimes and blood on Starmer's hands in characteristically understated style. What does complicity mean for an opposition leader? Because it's a very potent accusation, but also quite a slippery one.
I don't have any time for this kind of argument, I must say, for two reasons. First of all, on a political level, yes, when you're the leader of the opposition, as you hinted to at the beginning of this section, it really is a moot point what Starmer is saying on the world stage, because it will have so little import on the resolution of this conflict towards peace and a two-state solution, which is what everybody wants. But it makes no difference what he says. So his taking a very clear, careful diplomatic tone, and I suppose using his years of expertise in the legal profession to choose his words very, very carefully, doesn't make him complicit in any way. It makes him a very sensible figure, in my view. I don't like that word because I think it links to another trend that I've seen playing out just among ordinary people on social media, where there seems to be this deep pressure for people to have a view on the conflict, to post something, whether that's about the plight of British Jews, whether that's about the Palestinian people, about the numbers of deaths we've seen. All tragedies, but there's this sort of intense pressure to say something, and if you don't say anything, then you're on the wrong side of history in some way because you have not spoken your words. Now, whether or not somebody from down the road in, Manchester, Crewe, London, posts something on social media will do nothing to change the course of this. And that's in no way to undermine the power of peaceful protest and to suggest that we shouldn't be out on the streets sharing political views in marches and other ways of campaigning. But this sense of complicity, if you don't do something or you do something the wrong way, I think is dangerous. It seeps down into ordinary communities. It affects the way we engage with each other. It affects how we talk about politics, and I really dislike it. And so to see him saying that makes me quite angry.
Well, there's no political action here because the Iraq War was Blair's decision. I mean, it would have happened. Some people sometimes forget that it would have happened without Britain.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it was Blair's decision for the UK to be involved. The issue of intervention in Syria came down to a vote, but there's no vote here. There is no action to be taken, a line to be drawn. It's simply, are you going to make a demand?
Which will go unheeded.
In scare quotes, demand, a plea or not? Which is, I suppose, where I get to the limits of, like, I understand the importance of principle and gestures and stuff, but you also at some point have to go, well, is this going to make any difference?
It's also the flip side of that. It's like, if you're seen to be not saying something, that by implication, you are X, Y, or Z, or if you make some kind of comment in support of British Jews in the face of rising anti-Semitism, you're a Mossad hawk. These by association assumptions about who people are morally, personally, politically is really, really a dangerous route. And so I'm pleased to see sort of resistance to that among the senior members of the Labour Party.
Matt, with the resignation of quite a few councillors and so on in this front bencher, it's obviously an internal issue for the Labour Party. The polls, though, are not shifting at all. Labour still has a lead of about 20 points. Starmer's personal rating is unchanged. You would not know from looking at public opinion that anything was happening here.
Yeah.
Does that surprise you, or do you feel that actually on a lot of the time on foreign policy issues, that's the way it is, that it's much bigger in sort of elites. So I don't mean elite in the Matthew Goodwin sense here, within an elite circles than it is for voters who are, more concerned about cost of living or whatever.
Yeah, I think from the polling, as you say, it might look like there's not a big issue here, but I think an internal crisis can quickly become an external crisis if the party continues to make noise about it, if you have more resignations. I think this resignation, he's not a particularly high-profile person. He was on the front bench, but not someone I particularly was aware of. He was the shadow minister for the New Deal for working people, so not sort of one of the top jobs. And so I think, the question is, will more shadow ministers resign, or will more shadow ministers make strong statements, which means that there's an issue of collective responsibility? And I think the other big issue is, Robert mentioned the activists. I think that's a big issue, that Labour activists by their nature will be very plugged into this issue, or a lot of them will anyway. And you've got to get activists out on the street for an election campaign. They will be the door knockers. They'll be the people sending out the leaflets and getting people to the polls. And I think a lot of those activists will be amongst the people who have the strongest views on this sort of issue, and will be wanting to hear something from Starmer or Lammy or whoever on this. So I think that it could almost be a kind of hidden problem.
If this were happening just before an election, if we're much closer to an election, you wonder whether that would deflate enough activists or enough young voters or Muslim voters.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, I read something the other day, and who knows, I suppose that's the problem with this story, is that it's impossible to know half the time whether you're reading anything which has got any validity to it. But someone who was saying that someone within the Israeli government was saying this is going to go on for months. We are not going to have. This is not going to be a quick thing. It's not
I
going to be a
read
quick
18 months. It could easily be into the election.
Exactly, and so and I suppose by the time we get to an election, it could have been months and months of grinding horribleness, and the sort of need for some action to be taken, some gesture to be taken, gets bigger and bigger, and that. I think in a funny sort of way, if the election was now, it would be fine for Starmer because it wouldn't have had time to kind of seep into people's brains about it. But if this is in 6, 9, 10 months' time, it could be really bad, I think.
Robert, finally, to sort of return to this point of that the expectations are greater because we're expecting Starmer to be Prime Minister. Looking at precedents, 1945 doesn't really work because it was a surprise and Attlee was in the War Cabinet already. So we're looking at Wilson 64 and Blair 97, the classics. Were they also treated like a year or even 2 years out as inevitable prime ministers? And did they have to change their behaviour accordingly?
I think they're regarded as likely prime ministers, although Wilson, of course, hadn't been there very long in 64 and only just, in fact, crawls across the line. I think Labour tends to be inoculated against the idea that its leaders are inevitable prime ministers simply because of its abysmal electoral records. That Wilson is coming into the election in 64 on the back of 3 consecutive Labour defeats. Blair is coming in 1997 on the back of 4, and in particular 1992 being that searing experience, an election that by all sorts of criteria Labour ought to have won when it loses again. So the kind of classic image of Blair holding the Ming vase and carrying it across the slippery floor, I think really does capture how that team feels. And in that respect, actually, I think Jeremy Corbyn is quite an unusual leader of the opposition, in that Corbyn had a really powerful sense that he spoke for the people, he spoke for the 99%, and that was to some extent impervious to the evidence of the polls. But in a way, that made him a more confident leader of the opposition than Labour leaders tend to be, because I think most Labour leaders secretly suspect that they don't really speak for the people and they're probably going to lose.
And how does an opposition leader sort of prepare for power without seeming sort of arrogant and entitled? Because Starmer is doing what I remember Blair doing, which is sort of meeting with foreign leaders, politically sympathetic, it's not a summit. They just go, oh no, we're just having a nice chat. But obviously preparing, but then you don't want to seem like you're taking it for granted, but then you don't want to seem like you're not ready.
Yes, you want to look prime ministerial, but you don't want to look entitled. And I suppose that the best example of someone managing that is probably Tony Blair. I think it's in 1995 when he's talking to the Labour Party conference as leader of the opposition. He's giving his keynote speech. And I remember watching it as a nerdish teenager. And in the middle of it, he announced that he had negotiated an agreement with British Telecom that would connect every school in the country to the internet. And it was a fall-off-your-chair moment. I had no idea what the internet was. But there was a sense that this guy was already governing the country.
It was
already,
great, no downside.
Yeah, already making things better without waiting for the trappings of office. And as a piece of theatre, it was absolutely perfect. But it's very hard to pull that off.
So we've reached the end of the show and time to speak quickly about stories that have gone under the radar this week. Hannah.
So I'm going to do a very cheeky thing and use this to punt one of my own stories. But I interviewed these two fascinating women for the iPaper in the last week who have launched, they're young entrepreneurs in their early 30s, and they've launched a new website, which is a bit like Glassdoor. You know, that website that where you can basically rate your employer. This one is very specifically about family-friendly policies. So maternity packages, flexible working, paternity leave, and so on. All of this stuff is very often completely opaque, so you don't know until you're actually working for a company what the policy would be. And it essentially is signing up users to share their company's policies, and then it's ranking them all against each other. And it's just a way to give power back to women when they're deciding where they want to work, when they want to get pregnant. So you can use literally the power of your feet to choose an employer that's going to treat you well. I just think it's brilliant. And it's called Nugget Savings, so go and have a look at it.
It's up and running, is it?
It's up and running. They've got 7,000 employers named and shamed and also praised for the good ones on there now. But you can either sign up and pay to use it to look at it, or if you join and give your own company's details, they will let you join for free. Yeah, have a look at that. I wrote about it in the iPaper this week.
Matt.
Well, Reuters have reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin has decided to run in next March's presidential election.
Because he's going to face some stiff opposition.
In a move that would keep him into power at least until 2030, which would take him way past Stalin's record. Which I just saw that, and it was just like a line on a news channel. And I just thought it's fascinating, isn't it, that he's just been there since '99. He's been there through so much of the. He's been there pre 9/11. He's been through all of that, and he's still going. And obviously the Ukraine war and beyond. And this idea that he's still going to probably be there in another 5-10 years' time, unless illness or something takes over.
I mean, obviously, it's not strictly democratic country,
sure,
at the moment. But I do sometimes feel about Netanyahu, where it is democratic, but and because he's been in and out of office. But he's just been. It's just one of those people. It's like, why won't you fuck off? Like, it feels like they've been around for like half. I mean, literally, they have been around for like half my life.
Yeah,
these same people. I'm not saying that Putin would be replaced by some kind of
groovy guy,
groovy liberal, but just somebody that wasn't him.
Yeah.
Sometimes one just wishes that there was some kind of horse riding incident that caused him to retire early from the earth.
Watch
Robert.
your drinks now after saying that.
Don't go to a sushi restaurant.
I'm not a horse. I wouldn't be responsible.
Okay.
I'm just saying, what if? Robert.
Well, I always like a good historical story, and there was a lovely story a few days ago about a researcher in Cambridge who has become the first person in 275 years to read letters that were sent to French sailors during the 7 Years' War, and they didn't arrive either because the sailors were dead or because they'd been captured, and they ended up in the Admiralty in London. And he's opened them up, and they're just the most beautiful letters. They're mothers writing to their sons, they're girls writing to their sweethearts, they're worried about whether they're warm enough, they're talking about, how they miss them or sometimes rebuking them. And so it's a nice feel-good story, but also I think actually it's quite a story of this moment, because we're all thinking about war right now. And for all kinds of good reasons, we often draw a line between soldiers and civilians, and soldiers are legitimate targets and civilians are not. But actually soldiers themselves are generally young guys, now young women, who also have lives stretching out in front of them and people who care about them, and that war is a tragedy for them as well. So it's a lovely story, but I think it's also quite a resonant one.
That's very moving. Mine isn't moving, but maybe encouraging. There was a recent New York Times poll which suggested that Trump would win in 2024, and there was lots of fuss about whether this sounded like, whether it made sense, like the methodology they'd used, whether polls this far out from election are any good at all. Anyway, the US just had a wave of elections. It's one of those things, they're not midterm, they just love elections in the US. And the Democrats retained the governorship of Kentucky, which is very red. They won both houses in the Virginia legislature. They flipped a district in New Jersey that went for Trump by 35 points. Also, abortion rights protections and marijuana legislation passed in Ohio, and so on. And so it was really quite promising for both Democrats, for liberals. It showed that abortion rights was still an enormous issue. MAGA did not do very well. The Republican governor Glenn Youngkin in Virginia did well because he sort of presents himself as quite reasonable. And so the message to take from that is, even though Biden is very unpopular, so are the Republicans. And the people generally like the Democrats. And if you actually looked at a poll, generic Democrat thrashes Trump. And so there are various issues with Biden, who I happen to think has been, like a pretty good president, certainly better than his approval rating suggests. But this is not good news for Republicans. So I found that quite encouraging. And actual election results are always better than polls. And that's the show. Thank you to Hannah Fearn.
Thank you.
Matt Green.
Thank you.
And our guest, Robert Saunders.
Thanks very much.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a hearty salute to our supporters. You could join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more if you search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. We'll see you next time.